everyone, I hope you're all safe and well. There's going to be a bit more of an intro on this video than I usually do, but it is important, you'll see why. So far with the true crime videos I've done, I know I've only done a handful. No case is worse than any others, but for certain things I like to give the warnings that you'll see at the very beginning. With true crime videos, they're always going to have a sad element to them. You know, someone's going to be hurt or be killed in them. If reports don't give much information about the injuries, if they say, you know, oh, this person was shot, I probably won't give a warning. But if there's more information towards the injuries, or if it involves rape or children in any way, I will usually put the warning on. For this case in particular, it does involve rape, so that warning has gone on the front of the video. The injuries I'll be describing in this video are more graphic than usual. I do always try and be respectful when I'm describing things in more detail. For this case, describing what happens is important to the story, so I'm not doing it just to intentionally be graphic. When I first heard about this case, I watched a documentary, and in the documentary there were reenactments and extra things that made the story more effective. With me just talking to you about it, it mightn't be, I don't want to say as bad, but it mightn't upset people as much as it upset me when I watched the documentary. If you're not in the right headspace to listen to something like this, then please look at another one of my videos. That's all I wanted to say. You mightn't have the same reaction as I did, but if you do, you've been warned. Anyway, let's get into the story. I'm sorry that was a bigger intro than usual, but I never want to upset anyone, so that's why I wanted to give an extra warning. So this is the story of Alison Botha, or Botha. It's been pronounced in two different ways when I've been researching this case. It is a South African case. I'm just going to call her Alison from now on. So Alison lived in Port Elizabeth in South Africa with her mum and her brother Neil, and she always described herself as being pretty average. She wasn't really good at anything. She didn't really know what she wanted to be when she grew up. She was just Allison. She actually said that she had a certificate framed of a Lilo competition that she won 3rd place in, which I thought was really funny. In her last year of school, she was head girl before she went to go and do a secretarial degree in university. After school and everything, she spent 4 years overseas, and her mum was really glad to have her back, and Alison was working as an insurance broker. On the 18th of December 1994, Alison was 27 years old, and she'd had a lovely day at the beach with her friends. They'd gone back to her house, got pizza, and then one of her friends eventually at the very end of the night said, "I'm going home," so Alison offered her a lift there and back so she didn't have to walk alone. But when Alison came back, her parking space had been taken by another car, so she had to park a little bit down the road than she usually would. Alison parked up and she was looking around for something in the back of the car, or just looking down, not paying much attention, and there was a man that appeared at her window. The man then put a knife to Alison's throat and said, "Move over or I'll kill you." And at that time she never used to lock her car doors, so the man just got in and Alison moved into the passenger seat. The man started driving her car and Alison didn't really know what to do. Obviously Alison didn't want this man in a car, but she always thought the best of people and she thought maybe he wouldn't hurt her. So she was calm and the man was calm, and he said to her, "I don't want to hurt you, I just want to borrow your car for an hour to find someone who stole my TV." And he also told her that his name was Clinton. She wasn't panicked. The man was speaking to her a little bit, asking her, you know, if she had a boyfriend and other questions like that. Then the car stops and the man's friend gets in and they started talking about this TV. Alison looked in the rearview mirror and saw the man, and she just said he looked cold, dead and evil, especially his eyes. They carried on driving until there weren't any more street lights around, and then Alison knew at that point that she wouldn't be going home that night. They pulled into a clearing and Alison said, "Now what?" And the man said, "We want sex, are you gonna fight?" Both of the men raped Alison, one after the other. The men were speaking to each other through all this, and Alison caught the names Franz and Tians. After Alison was raped, one of the men started choking her and she just said, "Please don't kill me," and the man just went, "Sorry." And it wasn't an actual apology, it was more of a "my hands are tied" kind of sorry. She was being strangled so hard that she blacked out. When Alison woke up, she was being stabbed in the abdomen and the lower pubic area, and she was stabbed 36 times. And the men, noticing that Alison was twitching and was still alive, decided to start cutting her throat. His arm was just moving repeatedly back and forward, and he slashed her throat 17 times, and they were actually trying to get her head off. Alison saw the men get back in the car, throw her clothes out the window and just drive away, leaving her there. Alison is alone in the middle of this clearance, completely dark around her. She doesn't know what to do. She couldn't feel pain, but she could hear the most horrendous noise of breathing. She could hear her own breathing through a severed windpipe, and she was actually breathing through a hole that was just above her collarbone. As Alison lay there, she said she had an out-of-body experience where she could see herself on the floor and felt sorry for herself, and she had the choice whether she would go and be okay or she would go back and she would fight, and that's what she chose, to go back. As she was laying there trying to make this decision, she just thought, I can't have this happen to anyone else, and she decided that if she did die there, she would want to leave the names that she'd heard, so hopefully in some way they would be found. So she wrote in the sand, Franz and Tian's, and she also wrote underneath, I love mum, because her whole thought through all this was she didn't want her mum finding her there and not seeing that she was giving it a good go of trying to survive. So Alison decided to use all the energy she had left to try and crawl to get some help. When she started to crawl, she felt something heavy and wet on her legs, and she didn't quite know what it was until she realised that she'd actually been disemboweled and her intestines were hanging out of her body. Alison's clothes were still scattered all over the floor from where the men had left them when they threw them out the car. Alison grabbed her denim shirt and she pushed it against his stomach and held her intestines in with her to try and use that hand to hold them in and the other one to crawl. She got about 5 metres and she thought, this isn't enough, I need to do more, I need to get there faster. She thought, I'm going to need to stand and I need to walk, I need to do something bigger. So she used every bit of energy she could and she managed to get herself up on her feet. But she said when she did that, everything went black. And as her eyes adjusted, she could see little tiny stars. The men had cut the muscle in her neck that supported her head and gave her control over her head, and the stars were there because her head was actually falling backwards and it was resting in between her shoulder blades on her back. So she put her hand towards her neck and she said her whole hand just went into the wound. But she managed to get her head up and actually hold her own head on and start walking. So with one hand she's holding her intestines in with her shirt, and with the other one she had to hold her head up and steady it so she was able to walk. I genuinely have no words for this. I'm sure you don't either watching it. I don't have any words for how amazing this woman is. Like, every time I think about it or every time I say it or see it on something else, I still can't believe it. It's crazy. So Alison was walking and she was trying to get towards the road and she kept falling down, and then eventually she felt like she was being lifted and brought to the road. I think she was passing in and out of consciousness, but she said that felt as well like another out-of-body experience, like something was helping her along. When she finally got to the road, she was so relieved, but she was just out of anything. She was out of energy, and she said she actually did just want to die at that point. She had no fight left in her at that point, so she just lay there and she waited for someone to find her. And a car came along and they saw her, they stopped and sped off. This happened in the Mary Vincent case as well. A car just sped off. I'll get mad. But luckily there was another car that wasn't too far behind, and that car stopped and the people inside got out. A veterinary technology student who was 20 and was on holiday with a group of friends got out the car. He covered her up, held her hand, was talking to her and was trying to stay with her and keep her awake for as long as he could. It wasn't like it is today, barely anyone had a mobile phone with them, but luckily his friend did and was able to call an ambulance for help. They were only 15 minutes away from the hospital, but they had to wait about 40 minutes for the ambulance to actually arrive. And I've actually seen another report that said it was 2 hours before the ambulance arrived. I'm not sure. Either way, they waited at least 40 minutes for an ambulance to come. When the paramedics finally arrived, Tian, who was the student who stayed with her and held her hand, went in with her, and the ambulance wasn't really driving fast. It was almost as if they decided that Alison wasn't going to make it because of how horrific her injuries were. But Tian stayed with her until they got to the hospital. Alison had an ear-to-ear injury on her neck. The biggest wound from what I've seen was, this side. So it went from like around here right through to the back on the right side of her neck. And as I said before, she was breathing through a hole above her collarbone. And I think that hole was made from one of the stab wounds, but her windpipe was completely severed. She'd been disemboweled and all her intestines had sand, charcoal and other bits from the beach just lodged in it. Her small bowel was lying on top of her tummy. As well as the main cut which had disemboweled her, she'd also been stabbed repeatedly in the pubic area, so it was very unlikely that she would ever be able to have children. The blood vessels that supply the blood that go to the brain hadn't been severed, and if they had, Alison would have hemorrhaged and she'd have died within about 4 minutes. No nerves in the neck that supply important organs were damaged, and also the esophagus wasn't damaged either, but her trachea was severed. She was stabbed in the shoulders and the chest as well, but luckily nothing had got to her heart or lungs either. And it was also a miracle that she didn't get a massive infection from being disemboweled and crawled along the beach. Luckily, one of the doctors who was on call at the hospital that night was one of 2 doctors that specialised in throat surgery. They called for backup for Alison's surgeries because obviously they were so severe, there had to be so many more doctors called in. Not long after Alison's attack, she was able to sign her name on the consent form and also supply her mum's phone number. Alison went through major surgery on her throat and on her abdomen, and they actually had to take a scrubbing brush to get all the debris out of her intestines. They went through each and every bit to make sure that she wouldn't have a massive infection or have further problems once they'd shut everything up. Alison still had tubes down her throat and everything. She wasn't able to speak because of where the tube was running, and that was helping her breathe, and obviously she needed breathing after all the trauma that her neck had gone through. So the police came to the hospital and wanted to speak to Alison to help find out what happened exactly, and also to hopefully see if she knew who did it. They showed Alison a folder of photos of all the criminals in the area and turned them page by page. As Franz and Tiens came up, she pointed to both of the photos and also wrote their names on a piece of paper. The police were fine with this at first and left, and they were quite happy, but when they came back they said it'll be a much stronger case if Alison is actually able to verbalise this. But she had that tube down her throat, she couldn't speak. Obviously all the doctors had done so much work on her already to try and help her, and Alison's doctor just said no, like she's not taking that tube out. But he did go to Alison and say, what do you think? And Alison took the pen again and wrote on a piece of paper, take it out. They removed the tube from Alison's throat, and with her first breath she said, that's wonderful. And with the second breath she said, my attackers were Franz and Tiens. She is Superwoman. Alison was moved from intensive care to the normal hospital wards, and her friends were able to come and see her. They were obviously really upset when they saw her, and she opened her eyes and they were just completely bloodshot. But she saw how upset they were and she said, oh, don't worry about it, I didn't even break a nail. And she had, like, her nails were all cracked and full of blood and dirt still, like she still had so many injuries, but she just always seems to think about other people. Finally, she was able to go home from hospital, and she did have to leave with open wounds because it'd be a while before they fully healed. Alison had to go back to hospital every single day, so her abdomen wound would be scraped until it bled so new cells were able to grow there. She was just in pain constantly. So the reason Franz and Tiens were in that folder is because they'd raped 2 other girls before Alison. One of the women had left it a week before reporting it because she'd been threatened that she'd be killed if she told. The other one was pregnant and was really worried for a baby, so she went straight to the police. But they were known to police, they'd done these horrible things and somehow were still walking free. Unfortunately, with these crimes being reported and with the men just being let out, they knew that they would have to kill the next person, so they didn't tell on them. So that was always their plan, to set out to rape and murder someone, and they found Alison. They 100% intended to kill her that night. The investigator took Franz into his office and said, you're being charged with attempted murder. And he said, why attempted murder? And the investigator said, because Alison is still alive. And apparently Franz was just so shocked he said he could have knocked him over. He didn't even try and fight her. He said, well, there's nothing I can tell you because she'll tell you anything. And he took a ring off his finger that was still covered in blood and said, this is Alison's. Franz was 26, he was married and had a 2-year-old child. His dad was a policeman and his mum was just a normal lady who tried to raise him as best she could. It's hard to tell what background belongs to what man, depending on what you read or what you listen to or what you watch. But from what I understand, Franz had the nice upbringing, Tiens had more of a bad upbringing, but there isn't much information on either of them really. All of the evidence from that night, all of Alison's clothes, the car was looked into, just everything was put together and sent off to try and make this case as strong as they possibly could. Because Alison had survived, she was also treated kind of like evidence from what I gather. And from what she said that she had to go into various offices and just kind of drop her pants in front of loads of people so they could see all of her scars. She went for all the examinations, all the tests constantly. She still had an open hole wound on her abdomen. 6 months after the attack, she had to be examined by a psychologist who determined that she was just in a massive state of shock. At the time, the way that they identified people in a lineup was that they had the lineup and then the victim had to go up to the person, put their hand on their shoulder and stay there for a few seconds while a picture was taken. But obviously they didn't want Alison to go through that, so they went behind a one-way mirror, as they do now, and they had numbers and she just said which number matched the people who did this to her. So Alison went in, she looked at them, she identified number 6 and number 13 as Franz and Tian's. Leading up to the trial, Franz said that he was a Satanist and that he needed an exorcism and he was possessed, but he'd get the demons mixed up and they just knew that he was making this all up to try and have more of an excuse for what he did. Everyone just hated these men and wanted to see them put away. They were left with no handcuffs on because the officer said to them, "Make me die and run," because he wanted to be able to shoot them. He said, "I don't like killing, I don't hunt, I don't do anything, but I would have shot them." Alison stood up in the trial and testified. One of the things she said was, "One of my strong features I always thought was my neck, and look at it now." Franz the whole time was looking at the judge trying to intimidate them. The pastor who was sent for Franz went and testified against him in court to say he wasn't a Satanist, he just did this. Franz was sentenced to 3 life sentences without parole and Tian's was sentenced to 1 life sentence without parole. Alison said at this time she just felt emotionally removed from the whole thing. She'd get surprised in court when she'd actually hear her own name being mentioned. She'd kind of forget that this was all about her. Obviously everyone was absolutely over the moon that they'd been put away. There was a lot of media attention and Alison said the justice helped, but it didn't take away what had happened. Alison moved in with her mum so she was able to be looked after. She still needed a lot of attention with her wound. She'd still have to have everything dressed and cleaned and go to the hospital. After everything, Alison quite understandably suffered quite badly with depression. She didn't want to go to work, didn't answer her phone, and sometimes wouldn't even call work to tell them she wasn't coming in. She didn't eat and she constantly just blamed the men for doing this to her. She blamed the men for what they did to her physically and also for what they'd left her with, this really bad depression. Alison had a night when she was in her mum's where she just let it all out and she was thinking about her depression and what had happened, and she thought when you were lying there on that day and you felt like you came out of your body and looked down on yourself, you had the choice whether to live or die and you chose life. And she realised that she was giving those men power over her life now and she didn't want that at all. Even though Alison herself always said she described herself as being average and not very good at anything, her mum had always said to her how special she was and made sure she knew what she was worth. So when she's asked what was the reason behind getting up and carrying on, she always says, "Because I was worth it, because I'm worth fighting for." So Alison's depression didn't miraculously go away. She was still very understandably upset about what happened to her, but she was invited to go and do a talk about what had happened to her, and at first she was really dreading it. She said she was deciding what sickness she was going to come up with the next day so she didn't have to do it. She said she was never really good at speaking, but because of the kind of person Alison is, she didn't want to upset anyone or disappoint anyone, so she went and did it anyway, and she found that by talking about it with people, she actually started to heal. By talking about what happened to her and inspiring people, she has a whole business around it now and she's able to travel the world. She says she lives by the rule of ABC, which is attitude, belief and choice, and she says you have the control over how you respond to anything that happens in your life. Alison was married and unfortunately that didn't last, but she did have 2 sons out of that marriage. And this was after them saying that there was no way that she could have children. She said she had really nice pregnancies, she loved being pregnant, and she was able to just carry them herself and have them naturally. and the man Tian, not to be confused with Tians. So Tian was the nice man who was the veterinary student who lay with her on the night she was attacked. He actually became a doctor and was the assistant doctor on the birth of her second child. I just think that's so lovely, and it was because of what happened to Alison that inspired him to go down that road. Alison's one of the first women in South Africa to be so vocal about rape, and because of this, people often confide in her after her talks, say that they were raped when they were a teenager or more recently, and they're really ashamed about it. She always says if you keep something like this to yourself, it'll demand your attention sooner or later, so please confide in someone like a friend, a teacher, a counsellor, just anyone. A lot of people have asked Alison if because of what happened to her she hates men, and she just says absolutely not. A lot of the men who were there on that night were the ones helping me, so that's not a thing. But she said, I'm definitely more wary now. Like back then she said she was naive, she didn't even lock her doors. She said she's just more aware now. Alison, again finding the positive in absolutely everything, has said that she's chosen to forgive Franz and Tians because she said she just doesn't want that anger weighing her down every day. She doesn't want to give them any kind of control of her life. Even though all of this is very amazing, very, very happy, unfortunately, this whole story may not end on this much of a positive note, and I'll tell you why. Alison read in the newspaper a few years ago that Franz and Tians may actually be up for parole. When they were sentenced to life sentences without parole, so I really don't understand how this has happened. But Alison's absolutely terrified in case they get out. She had a woman reach out to her who said she had a daughter who was in a relationship with Franz from prison. Franz had full access to a Facebook account, and that's how they were speaking. Because Alison was aware of this, she wanted to let the police know. She emailed the authorities and said, look, he's got access to Facebook, he's online. Don't know if you're aware of this, but he's also having a long distance relationship online with this lady. Can you please do something about it? Also, I really don't want this to have come from me. Emphasise the fact that she didn't want it coming from her. Obviously, why would you want that? And she found out that the whole email had been printed off and handed to Franz himself. And in October 2015, they actually became eligible for parole, and Alison had to go again and say basically why they shouldn't be let out. I don't know how this has happened. Obviously, they shouldn't be let out. I think everyone's in agreement to that. Alison's story has been made into a film, which is kind of half reenactment, half documentary, which is the one that I first saw when I found out about this story. Franz actually requested an interview. In return for this interview, he wanted a letter of forgiveness from Alison, and he also wanted backdated profit shares from Alison's books and from her motivational speaking. I don't need to say what I'm thinking, you all know. Even though this story may have a bad ending, I hope with all of my might that it doesn't. I hope that they remain in prison for the agreed time. I should add as well, I forgot to include it before, sorry. The judge who sentenced these men actually put a special note on their profiles saying that they were dangers to society, and he made it very, very clear that he never wanted them to be let out of prison. I genuinely don't know how all this has happened. But to try and put a positive note at the end, I wanted to just end this with a quote from Alison that I heard in one of her speeches that I watched, and it was, "Feel the fear, but do it anyway." And I just absolutely loved it. So that is the story of Alison. She is living proof that you can make an amazing thing out of a bad situation. I just hope that they don't let her down. She fought so hard that night to try and put these people away. I really, really hope that they don't let her down. She did her bit. She did more than her bit. They need to do their bit and stick to the word. Do things properly. That's all I'm gonna say. Because honestly, I won't shut up. I really hope you enjoyed this case. I hope if you watched it all with all the details in, I hope you weren't too upset by it. Also, go on YouTube and listen to her talks. She's really, really sweet. She's always laughing and joking. She's so happy. I just want to give her a hug. Please watch her documentary, please watch her talks, and also I think I'm going to download her book if I can get it on Kindle. If not, I'm going to order it, but I'll link it below. I'll try and link everything below if I can. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've liked it. Please like, subscribe, comment, whatever you'd like. Tell me what you thought about the case. Turn the notification bell on so you are notified when I upload another video. I upload true crime videos every single Sunday, and I hope to see you in my next one. Bye! I've been dressed like Tweedledee through this whole video. Fabulous.